stylized drawing of a bird is the base of Faviola's challenge entry. This is the graphic, and yes, it's a challenge, including where on earth to begin. Anyway, starting point of getting organised with any design that has so many different elements like this one is actually the end. It helps to decide what is it going to look like, what will be the style of embroidery. Because the style of embroidery that you choose affects what stitch types and effects you'll use and how you use them. For example, will it be classic traditional, or maybe a handwork style, maybe thread painting, lace, one of the chain stitch styles such as Cornelli work or Cantha or Tambour, maybe a sketchy style, photo stitch, a quilting pattern, and so on. Once you've settled on the style, the next question that you need to look at is scale. How big or small it's going to be, and that really matters because it affects your decisions about the details and how you're going to move around that design. Are you actually going to path it very carefully so that you keep it as machine friendly as possible and avoid great big long scooting hops, say from one section of the design to another, like the top right to bottom left? In fact, the idea of the pathing is to try and get as few hops around as you possibly can. And your third getting started decision is colour. Will it be a single colour, or will you use two or more colours? And it's key because it affects how you're going to approach pathing the design. Specific decisions like pathing for colour, pathing for object registration, and of course at some point if you're going to use colour you have to consider the sequence in which those colours go down, and that has a big impact on what pathing routes are available to you. And Faviola, your choice of a line drawing plus sketch style using 8 colours has created this stunning, visually interesting to look at project. At 23 centimetres by 23 or 9 by 9 inches for those who use imperial, it's got an awful lot of digitising in it. A great variety of stitches, some lovely effects, and you can't perhaps see it as well from the photograph, but you can see it when you actually stitch it out, that there are some parts where there is relief created by light stitching areas and heavier stitching areas, not just examples of where there is satin, for example, here, and some motif stitches here, the single line drawing but repeated many times here, and back stitch, run lines, ripple stitch, satin, tatamis over here, some other motif fills, another motif line, more tatami with satin. Just an amazing variety. Many hours of digitising work and an awful lot of stitches to keep track of. And in your personal review note, I was glad to see that you're happy with the embroidery. You should be, although you did mention 2 points. First, you explained that your first stitch out was a poor choice of colour palette. Now, if this photograph is of your first stitch out, then I have to say I disagree. I think that the 2 golds and the 6 greens give a very subtle and really sophisticated look to this design. And the second issue that you raised was one that concerned your pathing. You did mention that there were a couple of places that you found when you were doing the stitch out that there were some start and end points that had been missed. But that's the purpose of doing the stitch out, and one of the reasons why you monitor it, so that you can go back and correct bits and pieces that you've missed when you're actually doing your checking on screen. And this is the design as it was digitised, and as you can see you have 22 colour changes, and so there's going to be a minimum of 22 start and end points, but there are more, and it's hardly surprising when we take this out of true view and go into digitising view, it becomes difficult to see where they are because there are so many. Now that's not surprising because you have lots and lots of standalone items which each have their own little circles and triangles. So finding the odd travel line which starts at the wrong end isn't that easy. And of course there are different ways in which you can check. You can run it through the player, You can go through individual objects and try and check where they are by selecting the reshape to show you the start and finish. But you have a huge amount of objects, and I think given the number of hours that it will have taken to digitize this, by the time you actually come to checking, it's overwhelming. So doing the stitch out quite often is a really useful way for finding the bits and pieces rather than trying to find them on screen. And in fact, in terms of doing this review, that's something that I did too. I stitched out your design, and I'm glad I did because I found a couple of issues that I wanted to mention to you, and I'll do those quickly before we get back to the main part of the review. I wanted to ask you about, when you stitched this out, what your feelings were about these little bread roll or coffee bean stitches, these little teardrops or pear drops, and the stitches that are placed on this scallop line. My machine had problems with these. The stitch density was the issue. Now, I wouldn't have picked this up because of just going through the design, looking at the objects. The stitch density of these, the stitch density of these pear drops, and I don't know if you noticed when it was stitching out, but there are 3 runs of backstitch on top of each other, or it's not backstitch, I think it's a sculpture stitch on these scallops. It gives great definition, but I have to admit my machine did struggle a couple of times with this, and in fact you can see 1 or 2 consequences of the struggle that it had. So back on the design, let's take a look at just one of these. This is the first one that it really struggled with, and if I just select object properties, and what we have is, it's beautiful the way it's constructed, is your little oval shape. You've used a tatami fill with this distinctive pattern on it, stitch length of 4, but look at that density, a spacing of 0.18. That's really, really, really tight, and the stitches were piling up and piling up and piling up. Doesn't have an underlay, but they were more than sufficient on that particular one. Then let's take a look at the pear drop. This was a satin stitch object, and this was 0.36, not quite as bad as this, but 0.36 in what is, if I get the tape measure out, actually quite a tiny little space. It's not even quite 3 millimeters, well, just about 3 millimeters wide. And finally the scallop lines here, and this is where these objects are, and as you can see here, the first pass is a single run line, then you've done a series here of the sculpture stitch, which is a repeating stitch, then you've done another track, and then a third track. So when you consider that this sculpture track here is 3 turns on that stitch, so it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in each tiny little section here, there, that on the screen only looks like 1 stitch, but in reality it has about 3 multiplied by 3 passes. That gives you 9 stitches all on that tiny little part here. On this one you have 1 track of a single line running stitch, followed by another track of the sculpture stitch, another track of the single line stitch, and then another track of the sculpture stitch. Each of these, it's a fairly easy fix. Let's just ungroup them first of all, and in fact all we'd need to do probably is remove that and that one and perhaps these 2 here, and you could remove those and it would be perfectly happy to stitch those out there and it wouldn't cause the machine to struggle. Anyway, I'm going to press undone here because that is your design, not mine. And let's get back to how you went about digitizing this lovely, lovely design. Right, you did it in sections. You broke it down, which was a really good way to go about doing this. The first was you did this moon or this sun. The second section that you then sorted out was the bird section in its entirety. And the third part was the spray of flowers and then these independent stars all the way around. And when we go back to the original complete design, we can see why then that if you do this section and there are colours in here that then repeat in a later section, that explains in part why some of these colour changes are here. For example, you used this gold on the stars, but you used that same gold here on the feathers. So at the beginning of the design, stitching out this section, and then much further down the line when you stitch this one. Now I don't know if that was a conscious decision or not, because of course by doing it in the way that you did, it allows you to be able to stitch part of the design. If I hide that, you could just create your design with the last two sections of it. Alternatively, if we bring that one back, you could have stitched the design and taken out just these last little bits here, or just done the spray of flowers and dispensed with the stars, or just have the stars and no flowers. It gives you all these different options. Well, now it's time to end part 1 of the video, and in part 2 we'll look at the use that you made of some of the motifs, and we'll also have a look at one way in which we can perhaps consider reducing the number of colour changes that we've got just by working on a little bit of the pathing in the design. So see you in video number 2.